We recently kicked off our two-part feature of what we feel are currently the best horror games in the industry. And after having spoken about 15 of those in the first part, here we'll be talking about the remaining 15. Like before, keep in mind that this is being presented in no particular order, and again, we will likely have missed out on some games given how many we had to choose between, so do sound off about those in the comment section below. With that out of the way, let's dive right in. Inside. Inside's horror isn't the kind that leaps out at you from the shadows to make you jump in your seat. It's always there, always in the background. You're always aware that things are not quite right, and the game is so much better for it. Inside's astounding, wordless storytelling, its striking visual aesthetic, and its perfect marriage of simple yet engaging gameplay with incredible environmental storytelling combine in what is one of the most memorable games we've played in years. Bloodborne. A bit of a strange choice, to be sure. Bloodborne isn't technically a horror game, and it lacks many, if not all, of the gameplay and design philosophies that horror games usually rely on. But when it comes to the one thing that horror games have to do more than anything else, scaring their audience, Bloodborne has it in the bag, and is probably more deserving of a place in this list than most games that exist. From the nightmarish monsters it pits you against, to the uneasy atmosphere it builds up almost consistently, to the gothic horrors you witness throughout the course of the game, Bloodborne's cosmic horror is the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. The Evil Within 2. The Evil Within 2 is the ideal sequel in every way. It knows exactly what to retain from its predecessor, exactly what to add, and exactly what to improve. Its story is more focused, its characterization more human and believable. It somehow manages to do the impossible and strike the perfect balance between a focus on desperate survival and offering players a fairly large, semi-open world environment to explore. It has incredible boss fights and memorable set-piece moments. The collective result of all of that is one of the best survival horror games in recent memory that frankly deserved far more love and attention than it got at launch. Resident Evil 2002. Remakes of games weren't nearly as common in 2002 as they are right now, especially for games that were just 6 years old. But Shinji Mikami had a vision for Resident Evil, a vision that he hadn't been able to achieve, a vision that he knew that with the better technology and newer hardware of the GameCube, he would be able to achieve. And so, Resident Evil Remake was born. And what a game it is! To this day, one of the greatest RE and survival horror games ever made. Not only does it build on the strengths of the original game, it also makes it actively better with crucial additions like Lisa Trevor, to the extent that it pretty much makes the original PS1 game entirely redundant. Resident Evil Remake is survival horror in its purest form, and a game that remains unmissable for fans of the genre to this day. At nearly 2 decades on from its launch, it still looks great. Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. The GameCube was an absolute dream come true for survival horror fans. While Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 4 were grabbing all the headlines, there was another game that was somewhat lesser known, but still should be held in equally high regard. Silicon Knights: Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. To this day, it remains one of the best examples of psychological horror done right. There's no shortage of games that question the sanity of the protagonist in unique and bizarre ways, but very few do it as well as Eternal Darkness. Dead Space. Coming at a time when Resident Evil had turned fully into an action series and Silent Hill was nowhere to be seen, Dead Space came along and showed everyone just what survival horror was capable of when done right. Visceral's first outing as a studio is a masterpiece of the genre. Genuinely scary, defined by terrific atmosphere and excellent storytelling, and the perfect balance between innovation and iteration. Killing Dead Space is to this day one of EA's worst crimes, and something that so many people still have not forgiven them for. The Last of Us. A decade ago, you would have not expected that the studio known for Crash, Jack, and Uncharted would make a post-apocalyptic horror action-adventure game, and make it so well. But The Last of Us is proof that you can never fully know a developer's full range of talents. There's nothing that we can say about its story that hasn't already been said, but what we're focusing on here is how surprisingly effective the game is as a horror experience. Its decrepit environments, its emphasis on stealth, resource and ammo management, its scrappy, intense combat encounters, its excellent enemy design all come together to make for a surprisingly good horror game. Resident Evil 2 2019. The original Resident Evil 2 is a game that is often regarded as perhaps the best game in the series and even its genre. Remaking that would have been a tough task in and of itself, and remaking it in the drastic fashion that Capcom did, tougher still. It really says something about RE2's remake's quality that it turned out as well as it did. Veteran fans of the original will point to issues with its lackluster A and B scenarios, and rightly so, but even such issues seem tame in comparison to the game's overall excellence. It is Resident Evil 2, exactly as it should be in today's day and age, marrying the tense and slow survival horror gameplay of the series' older days with all the flair and production values that one expects to see in AAA games today. Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Frictional games burst onto the survival horror scene with Amnesia: The Dark Descent in 2010. And even if that was the only game that they ever made, they still would have cemented a place for themselves in the genre's history. That's how good Amnesia is. The minimalist run and hide approach is something that's become increasingly common in horror games over the years, but few games have done it as well as the first Amnesia did. It was a game where the threat of devastating and horrific consequences was always right around the corner, and where you truly never felt safe, and it just never let up. The fact that the game successfully manages to keep that atmosphere up for the duration of its entire runtime speaks volumes about how well it pulls things off. Silent Hill 2. There's nothing we or anyone can say about Silent Hill 2 that hasn't been said before. It is the ultimate realization of Silent Hill, distilling all of the series' greatest strengths into a singular, unforgettable package. An excellent story, a spooky, atmospheric setting, mechanically dense and tense gameplay, iconic monster design, and an ending that knocks your socks off. This game is an absolute masterpiece, a shining example of survival horror done right, of psychological horror done right. Alien Isolation. The concept of stalker enemies is one that's been around in horror games for a long time, but it wasn't until Alien Isolation that we realized just how effectively it could be used. Creative Assembly's 2014 survival horror game is basically a culmination of everything the genre has learned about constant, relentless pursuers throughout its history. The Xenomorph is one of the most iconic, most terrifying monsters in cinema history, and Alien Isolation does complete justice to it. The sections when you're fighting against androids, where the Xenomorph sort of recedes into the background, are surely the weakest parts of this game. But Alien Isolation is a classic example of a game's good parts being so damn good that by the time you're at the end, you don't even remember the bad stuff. The Last of Us Part 2. While the game's narrative elements are divisive, something that can be stated as an unequivocal truth is the fact that from a gameplay perspective, The Last of Us Part 2 blows Part 1 out of the water. There's many layers to that, but we're focusing only on the horror stuff here, which has been cranked up all the way to 11. The decaying and overgrown environments are even more decayed and spooky. The use of lighting is incredible. The audio design is spectacular, all of which builds constant tension that you can cut with a knife. Then there's the enemy design, which in some cases, like with the clickers, makes enemies that were already threatening even more threatening. In others, like with stalkers, breathes terrifying new life into those that had a forgettable presence in the first game. And others still, like Shamblers, that introduce entirely new scares to an already terrifying experience. The fact that The Last of Us Part 2 constantly makes use of these enemies in excellently designed set-piece moments, like that apartment with the stalkers, or the descent into that terrifying hotel, or, of course, the hospital, makes it that much scarier. Resident Evil 7 BIOHAZARD. After giving us a game that had a ridiculous Michael Bay highway of death and saw the main antagonist turning into a friggin' dinosaur, with RE7, Resident Evil decided to dial things back and give us another classic horror experience. And it did it incredibly well, because Resident Evil 7 is probably one of the scariest games in the series. It is much more intimate and personal. Its story is largely isolated from the rest of the series. Its protagonist isn't a super soldier who can punch boulders, and its main villains are just normal humans who are losing their minds. Best of all is the first-person perspective, which brings you closer to all of that, turning an already spooky game into something even scarier. It It was the perfect reset for the franchise, and given how well the series is doing now, we'd say that it was an incredibly successful one. Dead Space 2. When talking about The Evil Within 2 earlier, we called it the perfect sequel. That's something that applies to Dead Space 2 as well. It is bigger and better than its predecessor in almost every way. There are some who surely prefer the more intimate style of Dead Space 1's horror, but then again, there are so many others who absolutely love the escalation of events in Dead Space 2. It has a number of cinematic set-piece moments with heart-pumping action, but at the same time delivers the tense, terrifying horror of the first game in spades, while also dialing the grotesque gore factor that the series is known for up to 11. Dead Space 2 also has an excellent story, told through a much more likable Isaac Clarke, making the entire experience that much easier to invest in. There's also a multiplayer mode, but we don't talk about that. Fatal Frame 2: Crimson Butterfly. The Fatal Frame series isn't one that has the same sort of cachet that the likes of Resident Evil or Silent Hill do, but it's one that horror enthusiasts go to bat for on a constant basis. And if you ever wonder just why that is, you just need to play Fatal Frame 2. That game is legitimately terrifying. It is horror in its purest, most unadulterated form. Fatal Frame 2 doesn't beat around the bush with its scares. It takes a fairly simple concept of looking at its spooky world through the lens of a camera and finds absolutely petrifying sights, and uses it in constantly genius ways that never miss a beat, and always manages to scare the crap out of you. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.